I would now like to introduce today's presenters. Michael Jansen, Chief Research Officer, guides the practices, research agenda, and architecture by leveraging his extensive experience to identify and unlock emerging trends. Amy Fong is a Vice President in Everest Group's Sourcing and Vendor Management practice. In this role, she advises enterprises on maximizing value from strategic provider relationships in outsourced services categories. Anushi Malhotra, Senior Analyst, works with sourcing and vendor management leaders on collaborative research and advisory engagements to help them extract the maximum value from their procurement activities. And David Rickard, Vice President, leads Everest Group's sourcing and vendor management and customer experience management services offerings for EMEA clients as well as select global accounts. And with that, I would now like to turn things over to Michael. Take it away, Michael.
All right, thank you very much, and welcome everybody. I'm Michael Jansen, and it's been an interesting year for us all. I know we've all kind of experienced this together, and we're in various stages of the post-pandemic recovery. We recently had a holiday here, and it was great to see full restaurants again. There are crowds at the airport and traffic jams. So it's back to the future, or back to normal again. I guess it's all the good things that go with that. But it's really great to see businesses and consumers. I was at a baseball game with a full house, 30,000 of my closest friends. So it's great to see things reemerging. And I know that other parts of the world are in their various stages of recovery. So we're all kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel and moving forward here. Now, having said that, we look at the business challenges here on the first content slide here. What we're going to see here, we'll talk about those, yes. What we're going to see here is the number one challenge as we enter 2020 and as we enter 2021 has not changed. It's still the precedence of the need to change the business models that are to make organizations competitive in the marketplace today. That is something that people have been working on for quite some time. Digital is a big part of that. The need to have a fully digital model across all channels and in all relationships with their clients. That has now not only become an expectation, but it's the urgency around that. It was certainly increased in the last year. You can look at other items on here that had small changes. Obviously, the recovery from post-pandemic has created lots of ups and downs and ripples in the marketplace. But the need to drive price cost pressure, those are continuing to be ongoing challenges. If we look at if those are the business challenges, if we look at the way those are changing inside of the enterprise priorities, and again, this is going to be somewhat dependent on the industry you're in, but the need to drive cost reduction has continued to be there to improve margins or maintain margins or maintain the business in some cases. The risk exposure, I think we all got a big dose of reality, and it still is actually a continuing challenge here of different types of risks that we had not previously encountered in large ways. So the pandemic, but also now we have new threats out there around supply chain. We have new risk around some of the cybersecurity and some of the things that are now hitting us on almost seems like a daily basis. And then overall kind of increase the productivity here. Now on the right side is really kind of looking at that from an outsourcing or sourcing perspective. And you'll notice a couple of the key items that I like to talk about on here are really the need for onshore versus offshore. That has become much higher on the priority list. I think organizations looked at the work from home and said, you know what, if we're not actually going to the office, doesn't matter where people are residing. And so with that, they've taken advantage of the opportunity to say, hey, listen, maybe we can use some more offshore labor in part of the equation. So they're upping the goals there to drive cost reductions. Amy, you'll talk about some of these other things on here, but think about more outsourcing to drive strategic exposure to innovation. That's been one of them. You care to comment on a couple of the others?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at some of these, as a procurement person, as a strategic sourcing person who's looking at, the trade-offs of cost, exposure, risk, and productivity, you really could go either way on some of these these decision factors, right? Do we outsource more to potentially reduce our costs and maybe increase productivity, or does that increase our risk? And it depends how you do it, right? Do we consolidate our portfolio? Maybe we can drive savings, but maybe that concentrates risk. On the other hand, expanding our portfolio, having more providers could increase risk as well. So there's no really easy answer to some of these trade-offs decisions that we need to make. One of the things we wanted to bring up today was just how do we, with all these options on the table, how do we consider some of these decision points, and what are the things we should be taking into the equation as we make decisions around which providers we work with.
Yeah, and I think that's key, that everything is on the table. That's been kind of the mantra for the last 12 months. I think the offshore onshore equation, and then the one that I think is an ongoing debate in our businesses today is really that the office based versus remote work from home. And I think finding that right mix and the equilibrium as we go forward here is going to continue to be an interesting debate. I know I hear it on the news almost daily of not only just the business news, but also just your local TV news. It's a constant conversation of where do we draw that line. So with that, let's do this. Let's get some input from you. It's always good to get input in terms of where our audience is on this particular webinar. So the first quick poll we have is, how do you anticipate your service provider mix changing in 2021? So this is a select all that applies. And you have a couple choices here in terms of consolidation, rebalancing, the provider mix, new providers, and even no change here. So we'll leave this open for another 10 seconds here. Okay, now as I look at the answers here, there is a one leader and almost three identical responses taking second place. We have a tie for second with three people there. So leave it open for 3, 2, 1. All right, so it's pretty clear that the winner of this horse race here is the portfolio consolidation. So the opportunity, the need to rationalize the portfolio has been something we've talked a lot about, Amy, and it's an interesting conversation of how far and what do you bring into the equation there. But certainly the number one thing on the focus on this webinar is that portfolio consolidation.
Yeah, and this is pretty consistent with what we see on the next slide, which was the question we asked in our key issues study at the beginning of this year. Consolidation was number one. We also saw a lot of redistribution, though, and a lot of diversification. And we saw overall 76%. When I think about rationalization, it's not just consolidating. It's not just going from 5 to 2 providers or 10 to 3, but it's looking at, do we have the right providers? Do we have the right mix of skills? And do we have work allocated in the most effective and efficient way, which is really the redistribution piece of it here. So it seemed like from that polling data, we got a pretty solid mix of people, but many of you or most of you are trying to do something. So let's dive into a little bit more detail on what each of these three options mean when we look at cost, risk, and productivity on the next slide. So we could look at consolidation, we can talk about redistribution, we can talk about diversification. As I said, it's not just consolidating suppliers, right? If it was that easy, we would have done it a long time ago. And consolidation of volume of spend is sort of the bread and butter of strategic sourcing, right? Procurement organizations came about, on the foundation of, we have all this spend across all these suppliers, we're going to pick the top ones and we're going to consolidate. So a lot of that's already been done. What we're looking at now is a portfolio where, we may be able to squeeze out more of the fat, but we also want to distribute the risk, and we want to ensure that we're getting what we need for the digital age in a talent shortage environment. So just to hit on each of these a little bit, they all have different impacts, and sometimes in both directions on cost, risk, and productivity. When you're consolidating your suppliers, your service providers, you may be driving down costs, right? We see cost savings of, let's say 28% is probably the high end of what we see when we're going from 10 to 3 providers for an area. But you also, in theory, are reducing risk. It really depends on the risk composition of those providers. If your two providers are in the same city, you may be increasing your geographic risk. So there's a lot of different levels of risk and layers that you want to look at there. From productivity perspective, your internal productivity is probably increased because your supplier governance is going to be better. If you've got the wrong people at those providers, meaning the wrong talent, maybe your productivity takes a hit, right? Portfolio research distribution is really about rebalancing the work. So say we have 5 providers now, but 2 have the majority, we're going to spread it a little bit differently in the future. And that could have a cost impact, it could not. But there is evidence that when you have suppliers, the best suppliers performing the work that they're most suited for, your productivity and your cost structure is going to improve. Improved risk management if you're doing some right shoring there and mitigating your geopolitical risks. So again, in a situation where you have those 5 providers in different locations, you may be balancing different geopolitical risks by shifting the work around. And you also could be increasing your efficiencies and your productivity if you're getting premium capabilities across the portfolio. Diversification is one that people tend to not think about, but when we're talking about portfolio strategy, I think it's really important, especially when we see, if we were to go back to our key issues webinar a couple months ago that Michael referred to, we really talked about the digital skills that are needed and talent. And we've had several sessions since then on specific skills that are emerging that have become harder to get. And the workforce in general, we're in a staffing shortage situation in a lot of industries right now. So adding additional suppliers to the mix can help with mitigating risk. It can help with productivity if you've increased your capabilities or improved your capabilities. It could mean your costs go up for specialty providers, but it also could mean adding another provider to the mix adds competitiveness, and that decreases your costs just due to the competitive nature of not being single source or sole source. So it's important to think about all these different levers. This is not a webinar on just how do we decrease our supply base. We're talking about how do we get the portfolio that's going to be the best support for the business and what we're trying to accomplish for our customers. And there's a lot of different levers we can pull.
Yeah, and Amy, I think if you add to that the global business services, the internal service provider or the shared services provider to the equation here, we see that being factored into all the things that you just talked about in terms of risk and from a geographic standpoint and the skills and talent, and how does that fit into the overall growth strategy of the firm? I think that becomes the other big I don't know what's called the elephant in the room, but it becomes the other big X factor here that comes into play.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point. And we see a lot of shifting of work to and from a GBS organization to a third party, often with the GBS organization managing that. And there's a lot of different ways that can help. I do see a question from the audience, and it's consolidation versus redistribution. It's a fine line. Yes, it is a fine line, right? And it can come from dissatisfaction. It can come from just the need that the needs changing or capabilities of providers changing as well. And I think the commenter says a more interesting question is consolidation with new providers. And I think that's a great point. When we talk about diversification, it often means adding new providers to the mix. And we're going to hit on that in a couple places in the following slides. We also, Michael will probably do a plug for a webinar we have coming up on specialty providers and where they fit into the mix. So great point. This is very often about where do we find talent or capabilities that we may not have elsewhere.
Yeah, so it's got to be looked at in a holistic perspective here. All right, so let's move on to the next section here. We're going to talk about market trends. We're going to drive into the specific research. We'll talk about some of the drivers and challenges into that. And so, Amy, you're going to hit the first part of this and then bring in Banushi.
Yeah. I want to hit a little bit on, when we talk, what we're talking about here first in terms of the scope. We're talking mainly about outsourcing service providers here. And you'll see throughout the next section, we did some research on this. There was a kind of a light study, but we also did a number of interviews. And of course, we're always working with our clients on there's situations, so there's a couple case studies that are more one-for-one examples. But some of the terms that we use, when we talk about classification of suppliers, we kind of break them into by two different yardsticks, right? One is their size-based segmentation. So you have service providers that are really tier one. When people talk about tier one in this industry, they mean greater than 5 billion in revenues, typically, roughly. We threw some numbers here, but we're typically talking about the big providers, Accenture, IBM, right? There's a whole range of other providers there. And then there's kind of tier two that might be smaller, like 1 to 5 billion. And then you have some smaller providers below that. There's also another dimension, though, around capabilities. So you have generalist providers they're service providers with a broad portfolio of services. They can do IT apps, they can do infrastructure, they can do BPO, across a variety of different areas. And then you have specialists, and those may be service providers that deliver services focused on a narrower segment. So sometimes it's an industry segment like insurance operations. Sometimes it's specialty skills that they bring to the table. Sometimes it's a focus on one area like procurement outsourcing. I can think off the top of my head of 3 or 4 different providers that are very focused in supply chain and procurement outsourcing, and that is the only functional area that they work in, and they do it very well. So you have all these decisions to make, and I think these are important to understand when you're looking at your portfolio. We're not going to spend a lot of time on individual providers today. We do a lot of research on that. We will talk at the end about a little bit of how you can access some of that if you're interested in a report on a provider as an example. But the other piece to think about when we're talking about this category of spend is that for these large companies that outsource a lot of their IT and a lot of their business processes, most of them have a fairly low number of strategic service providers across a significant amount of spend. And the data that I've seen on outsourced spend levels pretty consistent over time, although it's been increasing, but it usually is about 3 to 5% of revenue that's outsourced. That's a big chunk of spend. If you look at other categories, they're much more dispersed around smaller number or larger number of providers, smaller spend per provider. They also often will have 5 to 15 providers across their IT and BPS categories. Now, not all. There are some companies that still have 100 different service providers doing their IT work, but most, and in the data that we looked at, have consolidated down to some extent to 5 to 15 providers. So think of it as that. We're talking about a big spend category with a small number of providers, and how you really tweak that just to get it right. So I'm going to turn it over to Banushi, who's going to talk a bit more now about the data that we saw and some of the directional findings in the research that we've done.
Thanks, Amy. So one of the first things that we assessed was satisfaction level with the current provider portfolio. And we assessed this around a range of factors, right? One is your structure of the portfolio, which is basically looking at the number of suppliers or just the supplier performance. And the other thing that we looked at was the basic parameters like cost, business, risk, and performance impact. So if you look at the results, and these are just general indicative results here. So if you just look across the board, none of the factors are actually moving towards the high satisfaction level area. So all of these are basically towards the moderate or even moving towards the low satisfaction when it comes to the provider portfolios. The best in terms of satisfaction level when organizations assessed, within organizations assessed was the right number of service providers for IT. So a large number of companies seem to think that they have the right number of service providers for IT, and that says something from the way IT is managed as a whole, right? With the VMO and sourcing models and sourcing strategies are set in place. If you look at BPS and operational activities, it's a little lesser, moving more towards the moderate levels. And the same with, say, business and service provider performance and costs. But if you look at the low satisfaction level, it's risk appropriation. And risk appropriation among providers, organizations generally have a very low satisfaction level with this parameter. And even from all the interviews we've conducted across clients, we've heard them talk about risk as the major factor why they're making changes to their portfolio strategies. So I know someone in the questions also mentioned personal dissatisfaction. So if you want to look at the areas that are actually causing the most amount of dissatisfaction, is definitely risk appropriation across the portfolio.
Yeah, this is really interesting to me that risk was rated significantly lower than, our business needs are covered. And it just shows that, the trade-offs that we have to make, because if you feel like your current portfolio is covering your business needs, but it's too risky, what do you do? That's a really tough decision. I see questions about, the cost of change, and that's certainly part of the equation and the decision factors. But, we all understand the implications of risk now as well.
Yeah, I think that risk aspect keeps coming up over and over and over again, and we're seeing little things that are impacting big parts of our lives. Especially in that cybersecurity. I hope service providers are listening really closely on that one, because they don't want to be the source of that leak or that work stoppage. Okay, so let's go to the next quick poll. And what we want to do is get your input here, is that which factors are determining how work is allocated across service providers. So we're going to open this up and get your perspective on these different options and what people are considering in terms of allocation of work across the different providers. So go ahead and let's go ahead and get your answers here, and we'll leave it open for about 15 seconds here. Okay, you do have multiple choice allowed, so the answers are skewed a little bit. Interesting one here. So I see a real dichotomy here. The answers. Okay, we'll leave it up for 3, 2, 1. Okay, so the offering and solutions and provider performance were what this audience said as the #1 factors in terms of how allocated it worked. What I see is an interesting dichotomy. We just talked about risk being an important part of it, and yet it's almost it is the lowest factor on this panel here in terms of people thinking it's how people are working, how work is being allocated here. And I think that's probably a really big statement to be made here. I know risk keeps coming up on the enterprise conversation. I wonder if there's a little bit of bias on this answer towards service providers thinking risk is not a problem. Mm-hmm. I don't know, Banushi, you were the one doing that research. What do you think?
Right. In fact, I completely agree. If we move to the next slide, we'll see that the results that we saw across this answer, they were mostly synonymous with what the participants have answered here. So the ones on top are the top 3. And this is exactly the same as what was pointed out in the results in the quick poll that we just did. So service offerings and solutions has the maximum, criticality, and that is followed by cost and performance. So I guess, we can say that, that this is something that is being determined. Service offerings and solutions are being determined as of now as a factor to determine how work is allocated. But risk is not being used at all. But still, we are really dissatisfied with the risk levels. So we have to do something about that. Probably something futuristic that should be looked at in that sense.
Yeah, it's interesting. We say we don't really consider risk when we pick our providers, and then we, backwards looking say, I'm not that comfortable with my risk profile, right?
Well,
and
Amy, I think that goes into the whole conversation that risk is now, continues to be a boardroom level, executive level conversation.
Well, it's not that we don't care about risk. I think one of the challenges in procurement is that, you can't manage to zero risk, right? It's always a trade-off of cost versus risk, and where that trade-off lands and what that risk tolerance is may have changed, right? And how we measure it and how we value the implications. So always a challenge of getting to zero risk or just lowering risk, but understanding it's not ideal.
Right. And one thing that has definitely changed, at least from the research that we've done from the last year to this year, is that measurement of risk has become increasingly common when they're assessing their provider portfolios. It's not being assessed as a very critical factor. It's definitely being measured to a greater extent. So that definitely says something. But coming back to this slide, if we look at the top factor, it's service offerings and solutions. And that's followed by cost and performance. But just looking at the first one, service offerings and solutions, where here there are two parts of it really. One is the tier one vendors that you classify at the top, like Amy pointed out. These are the ones that are offering a wide range of services, and they're located across a large number of geographies, and they're offering you maybe specialist and premium skill sets as well. But then so the tier one suppliers just rank high across all of these factors. But then there are these specialist suppliers as well in terms of service offerings that are offering you those premium skill sets that Amy spoke about. That can be something like digital design or product engineering or pod-based agile. And of course, not just IT, but across other categories as well. So really like two different ways that you can look at service offerings. It can be skill sets, like the type of skill sets, as well as the variety of skill sets. And I think another interesting thing here was service providers' performance. We recently did a lot of research on this aspect as well, as to how organizations are measuring performance in general. And we saw that while the basic level SLA tracking is being done across the board, many best-in-class organizations have also included innovation and process improvement as some key metrics within their performance assessment. So it's not just service levels is what we want to say here. It's more than that. It's what can you do apart from the basic contractual KPIs that you promised to us? Can you do something more? Can you improve our processes? That is also becoming increasingly important in terms of performance assessment. All right. So this slide really talks about, what is driving the changes, like why are these changes being made at this point? And we were really trying to assess, okay, what are the top factors that are driving these changes? But from the research that we did, we realized that it's not just one thing, it's a myriad of factors. It goes across efficiency improvement, it goes to need for niche skill sets, then again, provider performance, cost. It just spans across all of these areas, and they're given equally high priority in that sense. Just talking about efficiency improvement a little bit, there's a lot of, I remember when in the 1990s, we used to have only one provider, for example, just for F&A. There was no vendor management cost that really went into it. There was no need for multiple resources to manage multiple vendors in an IT portfolio or in an F&A or BPO portfolio. But nowadays, that's not the case anymore. There are many vendors in each service category that need to be managed on a day-to-day basis, from the governance to the contracting, performance with their QBRs, etc. There are so many things that need to be managed, and of course, risk as well. And resource management costs are also getting higher. And of course, internal administrative costs related to vendor management are also getting higher. So efficiency improvement really covers all of these aspects, that you're saving on your staffing time, as well as the cost that you're incurring and the whole resource management aspect of it. So that was one of the key factors that we really thought, was one of the major drivers, at least from the interviews and conversations that we've had in terms of vendor management. Right. So this slide talks about, okay, now that you've done your portfolio changes or you're initiating portfolio changes, what impact are you creating? Are there any challenges that you're facing when you go ahead and make these changes? So if you look at the dial at the bottom, I think you can see that the one on the left, internal resistance or misalignment of objectives with stakeholders, that has a really high score as compared to all of the others. And this is, again, supplemented from all of the conversations that we've had as well. Because whenever we asked our clients this question, they said that, yeah, I mean, initially it's a big hassle to get everyone on board. Stakeholder buy-in is a huge issue in the beginning itself, because the amount of complexity and the amount of costs that are involved sometimes when you're making these portfolio strategy decisions, it can get to be really high. So just presenting a strong business case when it comes to the right strategy, that even if your cost is going to get a little bit higher, you need to go for a right shoring model. And this is how it will improve efficiencies, and just this is how it will ultimately improve costs as well. It's very important to take all of those factors in consideration and also present the model, the right sort of model to business leaders to be able to guide those type of decisions. And another important issue that business leaders usually have is related to knowledge transfer, which you can see from the next few points. The one is productivity and time loss due to transition, as well as the loss of existing knowledge. So knowledge transfer risk is something that we saw has gained a huge criticality in terms of just making these changes. That these are the factors that are really kind of stopping these changes from being made on an easy basis.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to me that internal resistance is always like so far ahead. Right? Change management is always the hardest, and we can hit on governance in a little bit, but I think there's a question here around the cost of change, and I think it's really important to acknowledge that. I'm a big believer that if you're doing a total cost model and switching providers is on the table, you also do you model out cost of acquisition or transition cost across different suppliers, where you can acknowledge the cost to move move processes from one provider to another, the cost to add a new process or to add a new provider, and the training and all of that involved. There is a cost to the change, right? It's there, but it also balances out that risk we're talking about, or it may balance out, cost saving, be balanced out by cost savings in the purchase price or whatever. I think that acknowledging and calculating that and getting it all on the table is an important part of the change management process. So to address that question, yes, and one of the reasons is that you do have to, you need that data to have an honest conversation, given that there's almost always resistance to adding providers or changing the workload across providers. And in many cases, there's a lot of resistance to consolidating providers as well.
Right. So this slide really presents a case study of a leading transportation company. And I think it's a great example or a practical how-to guide as to how an organization really implemented, a sourcing strategy model in their organization. So they established a number of key tenets in their governance model when it came to the decision-making process. And they assessed each and every supplier on all of these tenets, and then only decided that they will be a part of the final vendor portfolio. So if you see this little table at the bottom, of course, it's just a representation, like a representative table, but each supplier was assessed on, which service line it covers, which locations it covers, and there were some redundancies as well. As you can see, multiple suppliers are there in one particular location, etc., or even in one particular service line. So all of these, there were, I think, 10 to 15 suppliers, but these key tenets were assessed for all of these suppliers. Just getting a little bit, yeah, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay.
I want to interrupt you.
So, yeah, I was just continuing on that, if you just get to the key tenets that they've established, they're really covering a range of factors that we just spoke about. So they're covering access to new talent pools, which we spoke about, premium skill sets. Then another one, the second one is support in multiple time zones for the global customer base, which is covering offshore, nearshore, and onshore locations. And the third one and the most interesting one that we found was the planned duplication and services scope. So this was something that this particular company was doing in order to ensure that there's no vendor that suddenly comes up to them with radical contract terms and they have no choice but to agree to these terms just because they have no option other than one vendor in that particular area or that particular service line. So building scope redundancy was a very crucial factor in driving the right portfolio strategy models. That is what we found. In fact, this particular vendor, this particular company had even set a ratio to that no more than 3 to 4, they have to have at least 3 to 4 suppliers in each service line. So that was pretty interesting.
Yeah, I interviewed this client. It's a client we work with a lot, and going through their process and their portfolio strategy, it was one of the more cleanly laid out ones I've seen, where there's 3 to 5 slides that say, here's our tenants, here's our providers, here's their coverage, and here's what you consider when you have a need, right? And that have a need and how we address a need is probably the primary step in the sourcing process or procurement process that we need to be able to address. That is, if you have a need, how do you fit it into our strategy? And it was a really good visual guide for making that decision. Which of these existing providers can do the work that you have and where? And if you're looking to go off of this list, you better have a pretty good explanation for why. Now, everybody, that doesn't mean that nobody's going to come and still try to push to add their own favorite provider, but you can have a pretty, fact-based conversation around it when you've got that already laid out.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, go ahead, Vanessa.
Yeah, another interesting thing they did was they set control ratios for each of these factors. So if we move to the next slide, we have a recommendation on how when these strategies are established, we can set control ratios to just set limits to on a general basis. So these can be done for like the previous organization did on, we have to have at least 3 suppliers in a particular service line. Or they can also be done in terms of outsourcing posture. So no more than 70% of spend should be outsourced. The supplier choices, no more than 50% of spend with one service provider. And even in terms of location, of course, like even the previous company that we just spoke about, they had set a control ratio of no more than 70% in a single location. And they were really working around how they can move work from offshore locations to nearshore as well, just to reach this particular control ratio that they've set. So a couple of, of course, these ratios just don't come like with the click of a finger. You have to go through a lot of decision-making considerations to set these ratios. So one of them, a couple of them are some things that we've seen before, shoring mix, capabilities, scope optimization, but an interesting one that is actually an upcoming one as well is CSR opportunities. So this sustainability trends are really gaining traction in the market in terms of suppliers and companies as well. We recently did a study on this, in fact, and we found that ethical labor is becoming a top CSR concern and is closely followed by safety as well.
Yeah, Banushi, I think that's a good point. We actually have a webinar coming up on June 22nd on this very topic. It's Digital for Good. It's going to focus in on the IT CSR opportunities and kind of take a holistic view of that situation there from a marketplace standpoint.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to our next section here. And so this is where we're going to get into a couple examples on the application services and contact center. And Amy, you're going to lead us off and bring in David here, right?
Yeah, let me talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the IT application space. There's a lot of challenges specifically in the IT space right now, as an example, where half the organizations we see are managing some kind of budgetary constraint, and 42% are creating some kind of right IT workforce strategy. So the right balance of skills, of talent, of locations, of roles. And that's a theme that I mentioned earlier. Talent is a theme that many people are struggling with right now. So when we look at some of the challenges, the changes that we're seeing specifically in the IT application space, it's reducing risk. It's optimizing costs by creating the right mix of commodity players, solution designers, and thought leaders. And then there's operational efficiencies in terms of tool and platform consolidation and reduction of FTEs, as well as how you govern and manage accounts and the relationships. So for instance, transitioning over to agile IT, how do we transition our providers into that and change the kind of the operational model that we work with them while still keeping risks and costs in control. And that's a challenge that we talk about a lot right now. Portfolio diversification is the other angle that we see, and that's around mostly adding specialist skills and having real IP or industry centric capabilities, as well as right shoring. We see a lot of support in tier 2 domestic cities and nearshoring. I do see a question around whether we see nearshoring overall, and the answer really through the pandemic and after has been No, for most areas, we still see more offshoring than onshoring, but we do have a lot of what we would call either nearshoring or, I guess down tiering to spread across tier 2 cities as well as the tier 1s that we might traditionally think of. Next slide. So when we look at some of the strategies in IT services, there's a phrase that we use quite a bit in our conversations, and it's strengthen the core and rationalize the tail. And what that means is really building up the core relationships with your top focused providers. And it doesn't mean chopping off the tail, right? Tail spend, if you think about tail spend in your overall sourcing portfolio, procurement portfolio, it's probably a much longer tail than what you have here. But you do have a tail of smaller suppliers to some extent in this category. And it's really rationalizing and thinking about, if you're going to increase your leverage of specialist suppliers, and 53% of enterprises are increasing their leverage of specialized suppliers, how do we make sure that they're focused, they're modern, they're transformative, they're standardized? How do we make sure that they have the specific services we need, as well as addressing niche needs like strategy or next gen consulting or organizational change management, niche platforms that others maybe don't have the capabilities to address, and localized or in-country operations. We often see the need in certain countries, and this spills over into the contact center as well, where you do need localized specific support. So the bottom here looks at some of the data that we had on the role of tier 1 specialist suppliers. The most popular reason for introducing specialist suppliers in IT application services was providing niche skill sets and proprietary technologies, and then decreasingly, performing routine activities and price challenge and having a price challenger in place. I think what that tells me is that it really is more about the capabilities and the skills than about the price and entering a cost challenger and introducing a cost challenger.
Yeah, and I think those IT specialists, we actually have another webinar on that on July 6th that I'd encourage you to put down on your calendars here. These are where we're going to be talking about these companies with unique value propositions. They're not household names, but they're certainly worth taking a look at and understanding what they bring to the equation. And they bring something very different than your core large scale global providers. And if you only look at the big core global providers, I think you're missing a real opportunity.
Yeah, I think that'll be an interesting webinar, just looking at the types of providers they're talking about, really the much smaller, not what we would call tier 1 or tier 2, but getting down to some lesser known names that can be really critical in differentiating in your portfolio.
Yeah, when I was looking at those names on there, I didn't even recognize a lot of them. So I'm learning some new names and logos as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting when you look at how companies have grown and filled in gaps in the market, right, across all industries. It's fascinating to me. So one example in application services, just want to hit on this. An example of a CPG company we worked with that had 100 service providers for application management and wanted to rationalize it down to 3. That is a huge jump in terms of calibrating and refining their approach. They also wanted to go from a capacity model, which is typically what you think of as a time and materials, to managed services where you're paying for the more of an output versus the inputs, and transform the retained organization as well. So there was a lot of steps in the process here, but this is not atypical. This is actually, 100 might be higher than we typically see, but it's not unusual to see 15 or 20 providers and want to get down to a smaller handful. We went about benchmarking this. The Everest Group team that worked on this evaluated 15 comparable peers across their industry and looked at detailed benchmarks in terms of pricing and capabilities for app dev, for management, for DevOps. One of the things that really stood out in a company like this are that they tend to have a skewed profile in their costs, where they're spending more on apps run than they should be. And the ultra fragmentation of the portfolio leads to that. Also, the practices around budgeting and funding weren't really mature. And that can have a big impact on how you're using those providers, where you're plugging them in. They also weren't really optimizing innovation and execution, right? So there was a lot of shadow IT. So the activity here was really around first understanding what others are doing, but also looking internally at where some of the weak points are. And when you transform, the considerations if you're in this position and you're looking to do something like this, is really looking at, your organizational model. Do you have silos? Are there certain areas where, the RACI chart is unclear? Supplier engagement models. So how do we engage with these providers beyond just time and materials? How do we set up a managed services relationship where the right incentives are in place? Visibility is really important into the skills inventory. And we think of a skills inventory just as we would, the physical inventory that go into your product, right? Having the right skills, the right skill pyramids, the right, niche as well as common skills is incredibly important. That drives your cost structure, and it also drives your outcomes. And then making the right investments for IT-led innovation. So all of these came into play as we looked at this, and ultimately this was, as I understand, a fairly successful project to help this provider this enterprise get down to a much smaller number and a managed services type arrangement. It's never a one-time fix. This is kind of an ongoing process of continuously managing the portfolio and the cost model. So I want to hit on that for IT. I'm going to turn it over to David, who is here as kind of our contact center outsourcing expert, and is going to hit on some examples from the contact center space, because I think we see a lot of these challenges in that area as well, and they're a bit unique.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. So yeah, I mean, as Amy said, I think contact center is historically been an area where it was always used or done a lot of portfolio rationalization and reviews of the portfolio. And one of the things that we've done recently in a piece of research is asked a number of enterprises, what will you do differently after the crisis? And the sort of the outstanding answer was that they're looking for more service provider diversity. So there's probably some underlying reasons for that in terms of service providers not performing, or they need to balance their risk. We're also seeing that they're also looking for more geographic dispersion. So going to the point around whether it's nearshore or offshore, I think it's about balancing that risk. And I think that definitely in the contact center world, business continuity planning is now really being taken seriously. I think people have seen their volumes fluctuate depending on what industry they're in, but really have sort of seen that actually you need to have a really robust business continuity plan. So do you need to think about how you're geographically dispersed? And what we're also seeing is that lots of organizations who do outsource their contact centers are looking at these new delivery models. So the hybrid model everyone talks about, so moving away from a traditional contact center model and having people working in a hybrid model. But people are also looking seriously now at the gig type model. So gig CX, as people are calling it, in terms of having gig as part of your operating model, but also other options out there. And it's also starting to think about how you can change the delivery model that you have today. They're also looking at their service provider portfolios, which is really relevant for today. So do you want a single provider, or do you need to have multiple suppliers? And there's a number of reasons that I go on to in a minute that cover how you sort of decide upon that. But then also looking at that location strategy. So not only the remote and hybrid, so everyone's always working from home in a hybrid model or on premise, but also starting, and again, it relates to the question, do you want to be offshore or do you want to be more nearshore? And does that give you greater business continuity? So all these factors are being reviewed by enterprises who outsource their contact centers at the moment. And when they're starting to think about that, and when they start thinking about, do they need a single supplier or a multiple supplier strategy? Obviously, a lot of that can depend on how many agents that you're outsourcing. From a contact center perspective, you've got a small number, probably makes sense to have a single supplier strategy. When you start getting to the hundreds of agents, then you may want to start thinking about having a multiple supplier strategy. But things like when you're starting to think about that right model, is are you going to get the service quality improvement? How is that going to help you to drive that customer satisfaction up, which is key for any organization servicing customers? How do you get the geographical coverage if you're supporting multiple languages? How are you going to be able to support those multiple languages if you're only in one particular location. So how do you give yourself that geographical coverage? Cost optimization has always been important in this world. So cost of support, trying to drive that down. How do you get that best model? And then business continuity. And I think that if we'd probably done this survey 5 years ago, business continuity probably would have been lower. I think people always said it was important, but have not necessarily put so much emphasis on it. And then we also see people considering the competitive challenges. So if you have a single supplier, do you get the level of competition that you want to drive? So the whole champion challenger model, and then optimizing your scope, and then also bringing in specialist skills, which has been mentioned a few times there. So do you bring in a specialist supplier and have maybe 1 or 2 core suppliers for your larger volumes, but then when you need specialist skills, you bring in another supplier. So organizations are looking at all these factors right now as they're coming out of the crisis and starting to evaluate their portfolio. If we move on to the next slide,
somebody asked the question about what a hybrid contact center model entails. Can you just hit on that real quick when you said hybrid earlier?
Yeah, sorry. So hybrid would be where you've got call center agents who are working both on premise, but also can be working from home. So they're actually working in that hybrid model where they're not always on premise and not always at home, but it can be a mix of both.
Thank you.
In terms of some of the sort of control principles that I know Banushi mentioned earlier, what we've seen, and I've personally used these in the past when I've been on the buy side, is that to really get that business continuity planning right, you have to have some control principles in place, and certain principles such as try not to have any single language situated in any one site, unless it's a niche language where you only can really get it from one location, but trying to spread any language support that you do across multiple sites to give you some business continuity. What I've also seen organizations do is to group their global English. So English from Asia, English from Europe, and English from the US, but group it together so you can have a 24/7 operation. You can really drive some cost efficiencies there, and you really get a consistency of delivery. And actually only use English in the region if it helps you to offset your costs. So bringing some English in region to maybe buy the price down. But thinking about how you're going to service your languages is really important. When you start thinking about sites, thinking about using multilingual hubs, and I think this is an interesting one for me because multilingual hubs are really sort of coming to the fore a couple of years ago, and definitely in Europe, we saw places like Athens and Porto and Lisbon, etc., becoming really hot for multilingual hubs. I think what organizations are starting to think about is if we're working from home, do we need these multilingual hubs? But I still think that multilingual hubs are important to group together your EMEA languages to really drive those efficiencies when it comes to a contact center perspective. All your support functions can be in one place and actually you can get the skills that you need. We also then talk about those control ratios. So what I've seen again in the contact center space is try not to have any more than 50% of any of your large volume languages in the same country. So often it's been the Philippines or India, but actually trying to spread it around even outside of the countries, just to make sure that if in one country had a particular issue, then you're actually not putting your business too much risk. And then no more than 30% of volume of any supplier. And I know that's sometimes difficult, especially in the contact center world where we get lots of acquisitions, but trying to make sure that you haven't got too much volume concentrated with one supplier, because if that relationship were to break down, you've actually then got potentially an issue with the suppliers that you're working with. So trying to spread your volume around to suppliers as well. So what we've seen is when you typically have a large volume of contact center work to outsource, working with 2 to 3 global providers who can take the bulk of the languages, but then actually bring in some smaller providers or niche providers for any of the specialist skills that you need, and trying to have at least 2 suppliers for any language where it's a large volume language to really help manage that risk. But having said that, if you move to the next slide, what we have seen is that there are some reasons why people have decided to go for single sourcing with one provider. And that can be for many reasons and many good reasons. So maybe it's an increased ease of operation. So if the business is particularly complex, we've seen organizations who have invested in that particular supplier to build up those skills. And what we've been able to do is say, actually, by having one supplier, you can really invest in that supplier. So there are good reasons for that, but again, you really have to think about your business continuity. Reduce your resource constraints. So managing suppliers is time consuming and can be expensive. So actually having a reduced number of suppliers can actually help you manage that. And then improving the supplier partnership. So being able to invest in one provider is often seen as that's a way to really build that relationship. Again, I think that my advice would be we just have to think about how you build that business continuity, because although you might be investing in that relationship and that partnership, things can go wrong. So you need to be thinking about what your business continuity plan would be. And then the last piece would be around the cultural fit. So lots of organizations are now really focusing on how well aligned is our culture to the service provider's culture. And it is hard to find that cultural fit. And when you do find one, people are tending to levitate towards those suppliers and really investing in them. And again, that finding the right cultural fit is a great thing to do. Again, you just need to think about the business continuity that goes alongside it. I think I'm just handing back to you, Amy, now, just to finish on some success factors.
Yeah, thank you. So let's just, I'm going to go kind of quickly through this. I want to make sure we end on time, but in terms of, setting up yourself for success, it's really about setting up effective governance, working through that stakeholder reluctance to change, and then ensure you have suppliers delivering upon expectations. I think the question of, where to start, that I see a couple people asking is really, think about what capabilities you need, and then go back to those control factors or control ratios or guidelines and guiding tenets. And that should guide your decision-making process as you look at the portfolio. Michael, do you want to hit on the next slide and just
so we're going to open up a quick poll here. If you're interested in getting a slice of the data, and this is really kind of done and provided in 3 contexts on service provider snapshots, location insights, or location spotlights, and state of the market reports. If you're an enterprise and you have an interest in seeing one of these in a conversation with Amy and her team, just go ahead and click the button now, or you can do it later in the chat. I believe it's posted there as well. So there's a link there to provide that. So I'll leave this open for another 5 seconds here.
Yeah, and this is just a chance to kind of take one of our most common reports, whether it's about service providers, around locations, or around state of the market, or some of the category management guides that we put together, and pick one. We'll share it with you, and we can have a conversation with our analysts as well.
All right, let's go ahead and close that. And so as we wrap up here on the Q&A, we've been answering the questions as they've been coming in here for the most part. There is one outstanding on risk. I did want to point out is, I feel like in this industry, I've been part of it for 3+ decades now, almost 4. And, we did a great job on the pandemic, really stepping up there in terms of being a true business partner. But if there's one thing I worry about going forward here, it really is around the cybersecurity and what we're seeing in businesses around the world being shut down, critical infrastructure businesses being shut down by cybersecurity. And if I could make a plea to the service providers on this call, is make sure you have your ducks in a row there, because lightning bolts will come from the sky for those service providers that have not adequately addressed this risk issue, and they become the precipitating event there. And I've heard of some stories in the industry, but they've been pretty well contained. But if this becomes a true, I can't buy gas, I can't get food, I can't get my lights on, and you're the service provider for that risk will be unexcusable. So just keep that in mind there. Amy, anything else you want to address on the question here before we wrap up?
No, I know there's that last one about kind of the where to start. Happy to have a conversation with that person. I think Venushi and I both started texting or typing in different responses and approaches to that. The where to start really depends on where you're coming from. And risk, we've done some virtual roundtables and published some research on that, but always happy to talk to you in more detail about what the various risks are to be considering when you're looking at the supply base. So appreciate everybody attending today. And Chiara, do you want to just put up the last slide, the webinar invite link in the chat? Because Michael,
those are the 2 webinars that I was talking about earlier.
Yeah,
the June 22nd, that registration's open, and the other one, July 6th one, will be open shortly. So appreciate all your time, and we want to thank you for your participation, and let us know if we can help.
Yeah, thanks everybody for joining. Great questions and great discussion.